So we're finished. We got one more Sunday, and I think this is part 5. It may be 4B or 5A. We're finishing up our series on how to be human. But what we've been doing is we've sort of taken our own kind of look at the church's church-wide series, which is Facing the Storms of Life. And what I wanted to do was to begin to look at, instead of looking outwardly for how we turn to God for facing storms of life, to in fact look at God within, the imago Dei, as the tradition says, the image of God within us, and to look inward into what it means to be human. In our most essential form, what it truly means to be human with one another and in this world. And so we've been exploring the different sort of facets of what that means. In the church today, the series is focusing on worry. You might have read the blog post. If you looked at the blog post this weekend on the church site, every one of them had something that said something like, "When worry suffocates," or "When worry overwhelms you." We all sort of had the same title, which is not usually the case. Even in the same theme, we don't usually have the same title, but I think everybody just kind of went with it. And if you read them all, you had some very interesting views, some perspectives on this kind of whole thing of how we face worry. And for me, in 11:11, you're already noticing, we're already addressing it, right? Because that's what we do in 11:11. We address it sort of with an antithesis at the beginning, with a song that sort of capitalizes on how we sometimes try to find ways to deal with the worry, which is sometimes by kind of building a life that sort of smothers the worry, right? We purchase, we buy, we live, or we drink, or we do whatever. This sort of runs away. It tries to run away from worry, but you can't really run away from worry. You can't really run away from fear. You can't really run away from mortal anxiety, but we try. And so you already get this antithesis, and then you see in the scripture readings, there's a leaning toward that, and in the gift of story. And for those of you who are visiting, 11:11 is a little bit, and don't jump up and run out the door screaming when I say this, but 11:11 is a little bit like performance art. And if you've ever been one of those people that went to performance art, you often were probably one of those that left, and you just were frustrated. Not just because it didn't make sense, but because they intended for it to confuse you so that you go sit down with one another and ask questions. And if you're like my wife, she'd look at me and say, "And I don't like being manipulated." Or if you're like my uncle, who took me once to a performance art thing where we went to West Side and we went to this obscure little hole-in-the-wall theater where it was just a concrete floor, crowded space with people all around staring at an empty bathtub, and a woman came in her nightgown, sat in the bathtub with a basket full of eggs, and began cracking the eggs one after the other on the top of her head as the eggs just drooled. And after about 10 minutes of watching that, people were visibly moved and others were visibly confused. And by 20 minutes, my uncle said, "We're leaving." And so we got up and we just walked out as people sort of seemed to be really moved with that. And he looked at me and he said, "That was a waste of a good breakfast." So we do things a little differently in here because we try to encourage ourselves, all of us, to reflect on things, to find anchors for reflection that are not in traditional ways, right? That you're not simply going to the Scripture and reading Scripture like you always read Scripture when you grew up in Sunday school or when you went to a more traditional conservative church perhaps or an evangelical church. A lot of people are looking for answers, and then I get that. We want to have a simple answer to some of these crises or some of these problems or some of these questions. We love to be able to just get from A to C by going to B, and would you please just tell us what you're trying to tell us? But I'm more of the mix master kind of approach to ideas, right? I could be going over 5 or 6 interchanges, and then I look down and I'm already thinking about the other interchange, even though I'm heading one direction. I'm thinking about something in another direction. But they all relate. They're all part of that same confusion and that same chaos and that same trying to get somewhere. Hopefully we're learning how to rest with the mystery as opposed to feeling like we have to have an answer. And that may be the biggest problem that we face in dealing with mortality, is we feel like we have to have an answer for it. And there's really only one answer, or at least one obvious answer, and that is that it happens, right? But dealing with loss and dealing with the grief and the pain of loss or dealing with someone close to us who's chronically ill or terminally ill, it creates in us a couple of things. It triggers in us a sense of loss of someone we love. Or it could be a job, it could be a career, it could be a vocational change, but it triggers in us a sense of losing something that will force change. As DeAndrea said, it's kind of frightening to go there. But it also triggers something less conscious in us, but we're nonetheless aware of it, and it's part of our unconsciousness, and that's the reality that we don't live forever. That we eventually, these bodies, we eventually die. They eventually deteriorate. Or as John Travolta said in the movie Phenomenon, everything goes on to somewhere. It's all on its way somewhere. But we don't always know where. And so sometimes we try to bolster that against the anxiety. I want to think with you about this idea of when we worry, we get so worried that it eats us up. And it eats us up so much that when we're not really thinking about the worry, we're trying to find a solution to the worry, we're trying to fix the worry, and at the same time not realizing that we're the one that's eating ourselves up with the worry. If you look at the root word for worry, it actually means to suffocate or to strangle, as if to slowly kill ourselves with anxiety and worry. I'm dealing with allergies right now, so my mouth is just dry as can be. So I want to think with you about how we then deal with this idea of being consumed by worry. And I worked last year with a friend of mine whose name was Trey Hammond. He's the guy that started, some of you know, North Park Presbyterian Church, you know, Uncle Calvin's. He started Uncle Calvin's over there, for those of you who are music fans and have gone to that. But he has a church out in Albuquerque called La Mesa Presbyterian Church. That church is nestled in one of the most controversial, high-crime, challenging areas you can imagine in Albuquerque. It's a low-income, impoverished area. It's high on crime and drugs. There's also a number of social services that are in there. And then right in the middle of it is this beautiful little church, La Mesa Presbyterian Church. And if you go to that church, what you find is about 125, 130 people in attendance. It's about the size that church will accommodate. Trey's been there for 20 years. And what you find out if you stick around for the week is you find out that about 80% of that congregation is involved in all those social services in that community. It had the highest per capita activity of people in mission that I've ever seen in any church before. People went to that church, people joined the church because they wanted to be where it was scary. They wanted to be in a church where they weren't trying to change other people as much as they were trying to change themselves. Now that's an interesting idea, you know? Entering into the maelstrom, entering into the fear and the anxiety, entering into the thing that scares us in order to find a way to be changed by it. I don't know if you all saw this interview between Stephen Colbert and Anderson Cooper. It happened earlier in August. It was a fascinating interview. It wasn't comical at all. In fact, Anderson Cooper said he specifically wanted to ask Stephen Colbert to be there because he wanted to understand how Stephen Colbert came to where he was with his father's death and his brother's deaths. When he was 10, his father and his two brothers, his closest two brothers, there's 11 in his family, but his closest two brothers to him were killed in an airplane accident. And it devastated him, of course, and it devastated his mother. And he said it was an interesting and challenging life for the next 15, 20 years as they all grew up and as he went off to college. But something he said in an interview struck Anderson Cooper, whose mother recently died as well before the interview, and he couldn't get his head around it. And he looked at Stephen Colbert and he says, in this you wrote, in your writing, you wrote that you were grateful for your father's death and for your brother's death. That you've come to a place of gratitude. That if you can't deal with what the gods dish out in life and see it all as gratitude, then you'll never live fully. And Stephen just looked at him and said, that's what I said. He said, how can you say that? Did you want them to die? And he says, no, that's not what I said. It was horrible. I still miss them. But I'm grateful because I've welcomed everything that comes into my life to see what I can learn from it. And then he smiled because Stephen's a traditional Catholic, but he said something that kind of resonates with what we say in here a lot. He said, if God's in everything, if God is everything, if God's a part of everything, you can't take some of it and not the rest of it. You got to be present to all of it because it's all there to show us something. It's all there for us to learn something. And he said, and it can be really overwhelming. But if we get past that part that's overwhelming, what we discover is we discover something even more beautiful about ourselves that we didn't know because we were on the other side of, or we were on this side of fear. It's fascinating. Trey Hammond, when I was out there visiting him in the church, he said he practices something called the rule of Benedict. Some of you might be familiar with the Benedictine monks and the rule of St. Benedict. He was a 6th century monk, Christian, a Catholic. And one of the things that he said that was one of his primary rules for living was he said, always keep death in front of you daily. Keep death in front of you daily. And I looked at Trey and I said, so you do that? He says, yeah, I do that. And Trey was one of those people that showed me that app that I've suggested that some of you might want to pick up on that I use all the time, and sometimes it makes me very frustrated. But it's called We Croak. And when you get the app, it gives you 5 times a day. It gives you randomly, it gives you these little statements just to remind you you're going to die. Some of them are beautiful quotes, and some of them are really disgusting, like you did get to go finally and work at that funeral home, and you got to be in the back as well. And I mean, some of them are really hard to sort of take hold of, and then others of them are just sort of like encouraging, like, okay, now get out and live the day. And that's what St. Benedict was all about. St. Benedict was all about knowing what you have and how important what you have is tempered by the reality that you won't always. So we always keep death in front of us. We always keep our mortality in front of us. Not morbidity, but the reality that we have this amazing gift of life and that we live it out as best we can. And we try to do it in a way also because being aware of our mortality, if we're truly listening to it and facing it and recognizing it and seeing it in the way in which life changes around us, we are realizing also this invitation to be open, to be vulnerable, to be present to one another in new ways and in open and sort of fragile ways. So I'll end with this last little thought here. There's this wonderful story. Let's see. There's this wonderful story that some of you have read. I'm just going to summarize it. It was written by Edgar Allan Poe. Now, call me quirky, but in 4th and 5th grade, I loved Edgar Allan Poe. And yes, it was pretty dark. But as I got older, if you want to know why Tim's the way, our older son's the way he is, as we got older and we had kids, and Tim was going into 5th and 6th grade, and he was reading, R.L. Stein, or I think was what the name of the author was, and it was these sort of goofy little scary books that they were just sort of like factory-pressed kind of stories that were all the same storyline. I said, Tim, if you want to read something scary, here. And I handed him Edgar Allan Poe. So Tim is the way he is now. But Tim also has a fascination with the human mind and an understanding of the complexities and the depth and the curiosities of what life's about. It's not about a simple ABC, a problem, a fright, and you get it fixed. It deals with complexities. It's dark. And the Maelstrom is one of those stories. Descent into the Maelstrom is one of those stories about 2 fishermen that they go out and they're fishing up in Norway, and they're picking this one spot that everybody knows is dangerous, but everybody knows that's where the best stuff is. Edgar Allan Poe also had studied depth psychology, so you pick up what he's trying to say. But they went out there anyway. They knew that 3 times a day, a maelstrom would just come up out of the water. Whirlpools would just come up. And you didn't always know where. The water was just murky and turbulent that way. And so you had to sort of get in, get out, and you had to be careful. But they went anyway, and they got the most amazing fish. They got a great catch, and they were making their way back home towards the end of the day in their small craft, and they got caught in a maelstrom. And at first, the water was just starting to swirl, and they were trying to make their way out of it best they could, but they couldn't navigate. The wind went against them. Any number of things went against them, and they found themselves, the more they struggled, the more they got caught in this whirlpool. Until at one point, they realized they were going to be sucked in. And so the younger brother was up at the front, and he was grasping hold of a ring there that held the sail rope. And he was grasping hold of it because it was the most solid thing connected to the boat. And the older brother was at the back, and he was clinging to a casket, a water cask. And the water cask was strapped down. But the younger brother realized that wasn't going to be secure. You should hold on to something tighter. And he couldn't convince his older brother to come over there and grab hold of the ring, and they began to get further and further drawn into this whirlpool. After a while, it became so intense, and the water was thrashing over, and it was clear they were going to be dropped in. The younger brother started to notice something. He said to himself, I'm going to die. We're dying. There's no way out of this. There's no escape. We are going to die. And in that minute, he felt a sudden sense of calm. Even though the boat was whirling around in circles, he felt this calm. And as he looked, the calm sort of opened him up to see things he hadn't seen before. Parts of the boat had already fallen out. Some of the casks were floating in the water. Trees were floating on the surface. Some of the objects that were light had begun to float. And he, at that minute, realized what he had to do, his only chance. And he ran to the other side where his brother was in this confusion and said to him, we have to let these go. We have to cut them loose and strap ourselves to them, to these casks, and that's how we be saved. And the elder brother said no and ran to the front to grab hold of the most solid thing there was. The younger brother couldn't convince him. He cut the casks loose. He floated out into the water, and he was taken under. But he floated back to the surface. And as he watched, he saw the boat get sucked down into the dark water. When he made his way back, floating to the shore, the other sailors were there, and they picked him up, and he told this story, but his hair was gray, and he seemed like he'd aged a couple of years at least. It got me thinking this story in terms of when we face some of the darkest, most difficult things, whether they're memories of loved ones we've lost, whether it's shame or guilt or frustration or anger with someone in our lives or someone no longer in our life, whether it's a fear that we'll never really get to that thing we think we're supposed to be. We all get caught in these maelstroms, the way Sonia talked about it last week, these neurological, emotional patterns that we can't escape because it's part of our biology. But then we associate these crappy stories with them, and we never change the story. And so what are we fighting? We're fighting the story that we're telling. We're fighting the very maelstrom we're creating. And it's sucking us in because we think there has to be an answer to that, when the only answer to that is to let it go enough to get some distance from it. So a couple of quick thoughts, a couple of quick steps. It's important that we remember, I think, daily. I encourage you to. Think about the fact that we're going to die. Keep death in front of us. Remind ourselves that we have this limited time. Now, what are we going to do with it? But when we feel ourselves being caught in these patterns and whirlwinds and darkness and depression and anxiety that we can't seem to get away from, and it's eating us up because really we're eating ourselves up, we can take a deep breath like we practice in here. We can resign ourselves to that story, take a deep breath, and get some distance suddenly. Begin to see it for what it is. But then we can start looking for what's floating in our lives. Where's the lightness? Where are the people around us who are light? Where are the moments or the movies or the creative opportunities or the walks out into the park or with the dog because the dog knows better than we do? Where are the moments that invite lightness of being? You can't run from fear. You can't run from depression. You can't run from the grief of loss. And it's scary to think that we ever let go of that because we feel like we've got to hold on to what scares us. It's what gives us meaning. But it's not really what gives us life. And at some point when we can learn to let go of that enough to take hold of what's light around us, we can begin to look back and see the darkness less as enemy and more as friend. Amen.